For 4 years, the boy in the gatehouse cottage had not spoken his stepmother's name. Not once. Not in anger, not in grief, not even by accident. He called her nothing at all, which was its own kind of sentence, handed down and served every single day in a house that had more rooms than anyone could account for, and somehow still felt like it was holding its breath. The staff had stopped expecting it to change. The boy's father had stopped expecting it too, though he would never have said so out loud, because saying it out loud would have made it permanent. And Marisol Quinn was not a woman who built her fortune by making things permanent before she was ready. She was 44 years old, and she had grown a software company out of a city apartment with water stains on the ceiling into something that employed 11,000 people across 4 countries, and she had done it with a kind of relentlessness that had cost her nearly everything that wasn't the company. People who profiled her for magazines always wanted the same story. Black girl from a block in East Cleveland, where the streetlights didn't all work, raised by a grandmother who cleaned office buildings at night, somehow ends up on the cover of a tech quarterly with her arms crossed and her chin level. They wanted the rags to riches arc. They rarely asked what it had taken out of her, and she rarely told them. What it had taken, among other things, was a marriage. Her husband, Desmond, had died 2 years prior. Not the husband from a fairy tale, but a real one, complicated, who she'd married 11 years ago when she already had more money than either of them knew what to do with, and who had brought into that marriage a son from a previous relationship, a boy named Caleb who was 9 when she met him, and 13 when his father's heart simply stopped one ordinary Tuesday morning over coffee. No warning, no goodbye, nothing. Caleb was 17 now. He had not said her name since the funeral. He spoke to other people. That was the strange, precise cruelty of it. He spoke to the housekeeper, to his tutors, to the groundskeeper, in short-clipped sentences that cost him visible effort but that he produced nonetheless. He simply would not speak to Marisol. He would look past her, around her, occasionally directly through her, in a way that managed to be more devastating than any insult he could have constructed. And when she addressed him, he would answer the room instead of her, angling his body so that his words seemed to land somewhere over her shoulder. She had tried everything money could organize. 3 different therapists, one of whom specialized in adolescent grief, and one of whom specialized in blended family estrangement, and one of whom did neither but came highly recommended by someone at a gala. A tutor who used to work with kids who'd stopped talking after trauma. A weekend retreat in Sedona that he'd refused to get out of the car for. None of it moved him an inch. He sat in his room above the old carriage house. He'd asked to move out there himself, 6 months after the funeral, and she'd let him, because saying no had felt like one more thing he'd never forgive her for. And he stayed there for hours at a time with headphones on, not even pretending to listen to anything, just wanting the weight of them on his ears. Marisol ran a board meeting on Monday morning that ended with a standing ovation for a product launch that would clear 9 figures in its first quarter. And then she drove home and sat in her car in the driveway for 20 minutes, because she did not know how to walk into her own house. It was her assistant, a sharp, watchful woman named Priscilla, who had been with her for 6 years and had earned the right to say things other people couldn't, who finally said it to her straight. "You hired a new housekeeper last month. Has Caleb met her yet?" "Briefly," Marisol said. "Why?" "Because Teresa mentioned he said good morning to her on Tuesday." A full sentence. Marisol sat with that for a long moment. Then she did something she would later be unable to fully explain. Something that came from a part of her that had built a company by never trusting a report she hadn't verified herself. By walking factory floors in steel-toed boots when the engineers told her the numbers were fine. She took a week of unscheduled vacation, which her staff had never once seen her do, told no one but Priscilla the truth, and had the household staffing agency bring her on as a temporary kitchen assistant under a different last name. Plain clothes. No makeup beyond what covered the parts of her face most people would recognize from magazine covers, which turned out to be more effective than she expected, because nobody looks twice at a woman in an apron carrying a tray of vegetables if they've already decided who belongs in a kitchen and who doesn't. The new housekeeper's name was Adeze Brantley. She was 31, calm in a way that seemed to come from someplace deep and earned rather than from temperament, and she had been hired 3 weeks earlier through an agency that had run out of other candidates willing to take a live-in position in a house the other staff quietly referred to as the cold one. Adeze did not know who the new kitchen girl really was. She had no reason to suspect. She simply found her oddly intense. The new girl watched everything, asked careful questions about the household's rhythms, lingered near doorways longer than her job required. What Marisol observed, in her first 3 days disguised in her own home, undid something in her she had not expected to feel undone. Adeze did not chase Caleb. She did not perform warmth at him the way the others had, the way Marisol herself, she realized, with a sick drop in her stomach, had been doing for 2 years without knowing it. The overbright tone, the eager questions, the hovering. Adeze simply existed in proximity to him. She folded laundry in the room off the kitchen, where he sometimes wandered through on his way to the refrigerator. And she did not look up. She left a second mug of tea on the counter, most afternoons without comment, and some afternoons it disappeared, and she never once mentioned it. The first time Marisol watched them interact directly, she was rinsing dishes at the far sink with her back deliberately turned, listening. Caleb had come into the kitchen, holding a phone with a cracked screen, scowling at it the way teenagers scowl at small catastrophes. He set it on the counter near Adeze without a word, an obvious unspoken request, the way you'd hand something to someone you trusted without thinking about it. "Drop it again?" Adeze asked, not looking up from the bread she was kneading. "It slipped," Caleb said. 3 words. Marisol's hands went still in the dishwater. Adeze said. "Things do that." She nodded toward a drawer. "Tape's in there if you want to hold the corner together till you can get it fixed properly. Won't be pretty, but it'll work." He found the tape. He stood at the counter, fixing his own phone while she kneaded bread, and they didn't speak again for 10 minutes, and somehow it was the most natural thing Marisol had witnessed in her own home in 2 years. That night, lying awake in the small staff room she'd been assigned, she had specifically requested a room in the servants' wing, partly for the disguise, and partly, she admitted to herself, only in the dark, because she wanted to know what the house felt like from the bottom instead of the top. She thought about the word Caleb hadn't used in 2 years, and how easily, how unceremoniously, he'd just used 3 words with a woman he'd known for 3 weeks. She started finding reasons to be near the laundry room. Adeze noticed her before she meant to be noticed, caught her lingering by the linen closet on a Thursday afternoon longer than restocking towels required, and said, without looking up from the shirt she was pressing, "You're new, and you watch a lot. Used to work somewhere strict?" "Something like that," Marisol said, and Adeze made a small sound, not quite a laugh, that suggested she didn't entirely believe it but wasn't going to push. Over the following days, in stolen 15-minute windows between her assigned kitchen duties, Marisol learned things about Adeze. The file from the staffing agency hadn't told her, because the file from the staffing agency had been compiled by people who'd never sat across a folding table from her in the break room, while she ate the same modest lunch every day, rice, and whatever vegetable was cheapest that week, packed in the same plastic container. Adeze had a younger sister, Yvette, back in Baton Rouge, who she was putting through community college 2 classes at a time, paid for out of every check. She didn't talk about it like a sacrifice. She talked about it, when she talked about it at all, like it was simply the next obvious thing a person did. She had a way of looking at Caleb that wasn't pity and wasn't performance. It was attention, plain and undecorated, the kind that didn't ask anything of him in return. The night it broke open came on a Friday in late October, a thin, cold rain falling steadily since dinner, the kind that made the old pipes in the house tick and groan. Marisol was in the kitchen scrubbing a pan that didn't need scrubbing when she heard it from the floor above. Not a scream, something worse, something low and continuous, a sound like a person trying to physically expel a feeling too large for the room it was in. She was at the stairs before she'd consciously decided to move. Adiazi was already ahead of her, taking the back stairs two at a time, still in her apron, and they reached Caleb's door together. Though Adiazi went in and Marisol, in her stolen kitchen girl disguise, could only stand frozen in the hallway, useless, a stranger in her own house, in the one moment her own house needed her most and could not have her. She heard Adiazi's voice, low and even, going into the dark room. Hey, hey, I'm here. I'm right here. You don't have to do anything. I'm not going anywhere. There was a long, terrible silence, and then a sound came out of Caleb that Marisol would hear in her sleep for the rest of her life. Something raw, breaking, 3 years compressed into a single syllable. Dad. One word. The first word he had said about his father to anyone since the funeral. Marisol pressed her back against the hallway wall outside the door and slid down it until she was sitting on the floor in her staff uniform. And she put both hands over her mouth and wept without sound, because the woman who had built an empire on never showing weakness in a room could not, for the first time in years, locate the part of herself that knew how to stop. When it was quiet again, when Adeze finally came out of the room an hour later, having stayed until Caleb's breathing slowed into sleep, she found the new kitchen girl still sitting against the wall in the dark hallway with dried tears on her face, and she didn't ask why. She just sat down on the floor next to her, both of them, with their backs against the same wall, and after a while she said, "He's going to be okay. He's still in there. He just needed somebody who wasn't asking him to be okay yet." Marisol turned to look at her, and for one unguarded moment, almost told her everything. She didn't. Not that night. What followed was the gentlest week the house had held in years. Caleb came down for breakfast twice. He left his bedroom door open during the day. He asked Adeze, with visible effort, whether she liked the herb garden the previous owners had let go to seed along the east wall, and when she said she did, he started pulling weeds out there. In the mornings before his tutor arrived, and some mornings Adeze worked beside him in silence, and Marisol watched all of it from windows and doorways and the edges of rooms, falling for a woman she had hired to scrub floors, in a way that frightened her more than any hostile boardroom takeover ever had. It ended the way these things tend to end. Not through her own confession, which she kept finding reasons to postpone, but through an open laptop. Adeze was covering for the absent house manager on a Tuesday, organizing files in the home office that Marisol almost never let staff into, and she found, tucked in, a drawer she hadn't meant to open, a folder of old press clippings with Marisol's actual full magazine cover face on the cover of 3 different business publications. She sat very still in the office chair for a long time. Then she went and found the household roster pinned by the back door and read the temporary kitchen assistant's listed name. And understood, with a cold drop in her stomach, exactly who had been standing across the break room table from her for 3 weeks eating rice out of a plastic container. She found Marisol in the kitchen that evening and said only, "Can I speak with you?" It was not a question. They stood in the pantry with the door half closed. Adezia's voice was quiet and very controlled, which was somehow worse than shouting. "You let me think you were someone who needed this job. I wasn't trying to. You watched me. You let me tell you about my sister. You let me sit on the floor with you the night your own son finally said a word, and you let me believe I was comforting some scared kitchen girl when the whole time you were." She stopped herself, jaw tight. "That's not curiosity. That's surveillance." "I needed to know if it was real," Marisol said, and hated how small it sounded, even as she said it. If what was real, whether someone could actually reach him, or whether it was an act, like everyone else who's tried. Adeze looked at her for a long moment, something in her face closing like a door being pulled to, not slammed, just shut, quietly and completely. "I don't perform for paychecks, Miss Quinn. I never have. That you needed to test, that says a lot more about the people you've had around you than it does about me." And she walked out of the pantry, and for 2 days she did not speak to Marisol at all. though she kept showing up for Caleb exactly as before, steady and unbothered, which only made Marisol feel the absence of her own welcome more sharply. Caleb noticed the freeze between them. He was quieter again that week, watchful, retreating half a step from a doorway he'd only just started to enter. And it was that, more than her own wounded pride, that finally moved Marisol to act. She went to the small room off the kitchen where Adieze stayed and knocked, and when the door opened she didn't try to explain herself further. She said, "Whatever you're owed from me, you're owed." But he's pulling back again, and I am asking you, not as your employer, as his mother in every way that's mattered for 11 years, even when he won't say my name, please don't let this be one more thing he loses. Adize studied her for a long moment, and something in her posture eased, not forgiveness exactly, but a willingness to keep standing in the same room. "He's not going to lose me," she said. "Whatever you and I are dealing with, that boy doesn't carry the bill for it. I won't let that happen to him." And she went and knocked on Caleb's door and said through it, "Still here. Nothing's different. You want to help me figure out what's wrong with the dishwasher, because I genuinely cannot tell." And after a pause, Caleb said, "Yeah, okay," in a voice that was still finding its footing, but was unmistakably his own. After that, Marisol stopped wearing the apron. She told Caleb the truth herself, sitting across from him at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, no audience, no rehearsed speech. She told him she'd been afraid that nothing she did as his stepmother would ever be enough to reach him, and that fear had made her dishonest in a house where he most needed honesty, and that she was sorry, fully, without decorating the apology with excuses. Caleb listened, with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, and when she finished he said quietly, "You scrubbed our dishes for 3 weeks." And there was, for the first time in 2 years, the ghost of something almost like amusement at the corner of his mouth. And Marisol laughed despite herself, wet-eyed, and it was the first real laugh that had passed between them since his father's funeral. She had a longer, harder conversation with Adieze that same week, in the garden, not the pantry. She'd learned that much. She apologized without conditions. She told her, honestly, that somewhere in those 3 weeks of watching her, she had stopped thinking about whether Adieze was good for Caleb, and started thinking about how rarely, in 11 years of being the woman who built everything, anyone had simply talked to her like a person instead of a name on a building. Adieze listened to all of it with her characteristic stillness, giving nothing away too quickly. Then she asked, "When you found out who I really was talking to all those weeks, was there ever a day you thought about just telling me yourself?" "Every day," Marisol said. "I didn't know how to stop being useful to people without using my money to do it." "That might be the truest thing you've said to me yet," Adieze said, and something in the set of her shoulders softened, and she said, "Okay, just okay," and Marisol understood it the way it was meant, not as resolution, but as permission to keep going. Winter came, and the house thawed in ways that had nothing to do with the weather. Caleb went back to a handful of classes at the community college near the estate, came home most afternoons, and sat at the table doing problem sets, occasionally muttering something dry and observant about a classmate that made both women laugh, the kind of small, sharp humor Marisol recognized, with an ache, as something of his father's. Marisol started a foundation that winter, funding mentorship and grief programs for kids in cities like the one she'd grown up in. Places where a kid who stopped talking after a loss might not get 3 therapists, and a Sedona retreat might just get written off as difficult. She named it for Desmond, quietly, without a press release, because it had never been about her name being on anything. She asked Adieze to help run it. Not as a reward, she was careful to say, and Adieze, just as careful, told her she'd only take it if it was real work she believed in, with her own authority over decisions. And Marisol said done, and meant it. By spring they were tending the herb garden together on Saturdays. The 3 of them, not by arrangement, but by habit. The kind of habit families build without ever deciding to build it. Caleb planted a row of sunflowers along the fence line in April, mostly to see if he could get them taller than the gate, and by June they'd cleared it by a foot. And the afternoon he discovered that he came running across the yard yelling for both of them to come look. And Marisol thought, watching him run, that she had not seen him run anywhere in 3 years. It was a Thursday evening near the end of June when Marisol finally said the thing she'd been circling for months, standing with Adieze by the sunflowers, in the gold hour before dark, the air thick with cut grass, and the particular sweetness of a Midwestern summer evening. She told her, without rehearsal, that she did not know how to be soft. That softness had never built anything she could point to, but that somewhere in 3 weeks of scrubbing dishes, she'd learned more about being a mother and being a person than in 11 years of doing it the way she thought it was supposed to be done. And that none of that had been about Caleb. Not really. Not anymore. It was about her. Adaze didn't answer right away. She looked out at the sunflowers for a long moment and said, "First thing I thought, when I found out who you really were, I thought, of course, the one person in this whole house who ever talked to me like I mattered was the one lying about who she was. I know. And the second thing I thought," a Daisy said, "was that you did talk to me like I mattered. Even when you didn't have to. That's not nothing." "It's not enough," Marisol said. "No," a Daisy said. "But it's a start." The proposal, when it came on an ordinary Thursday near the herb beds. No orchestra, no rehearsed line, Marisol simply going still mid-sentence about nothing in particular. And then, with a steadiness she'd built boardrooms on and had never once used for anything this terrifying, going down on one knee in the dirt and telling Adaze that she had not saved a company or closed a deal that mattered as much as the 3 weeks Adaze had spent not knowing who she was, and treating her like she mattered anyway, and asking her, plainly, to stay, not as staff, not as a program director, just as the person she wanted beside her for whatever came next. From the porch steps, where he'd been sitting with his homework forgotten in his lap, Caleb's voice came across the yard, cracking slightly with something that was half laughter and half 3 years finally letting go. "Say yes. Come on, say yes." Adaze did, laughing and crying at once, and Caleb came down off the porch, and the three of them stood together in the failing light among the sunflowers. He'd grown taller than the gate. And later, sitting on the steps as the stars came up over the fence line, Caleb said quietly, to no one and everyone, he would have liked her too. Dad would have liked her. He would have, Marisol said, and put her hand over his, and none of them said anything else, because there was nothing left that needed saying. Sometimes the person who saves a family is not the one with the most to give. Sometimes it is simply the one who shows up without asking anything in return and stays long enough for everyone else to remember how to come home.